On the morning of January 28, 1986, 7 people boarded Space Shuttle Challenger, believing they would spend the coming days in orbit. Instead, 73 seconds after liftoff, the world watched a plume of smoke tear apart against a clear Florida sky, and an entire nation was left staring at a horizon where a spacecraft used to be. Most people who remember that day remember the explosion. Far fewer know what happened in the minutes, weeks, and months that followed. The part of this account that never made it onto the news broadcasts, and the part that deserves to be told honestly, without exaggeration, and with respect for 7 people who did not choose to become a lesson in tragedy. The crew was Commander Dick Scobee, a former test pilot known for his calm leadership, pilot Michael Smith, on his first spaceflight, mission specialist Judith Resnik, an electrical engineer and the second American woman in space, mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, an engineer from Hawaii and the first Asian American to reach orbit, mission specialist Ronald McNair, a physicist who had grown up in the segregated South, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, an engineer who had waited through several bump missions for his turn to fly, and payload specialist Christa McAuliffe, a New Hampshire social studies teacher selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first ordinary citizen in space. McAuliffe's presence is a large part of why the disaster is remembered the way it is. Schools across the country had tuned in specifically to watch her, which meant thousands of children witnessed the breakup live, unfiltered, without anyone able to prepare them for what they were seeing. The conditions that morning should have kept Challenger on the ground. Overnight temperatures in Florida had dropped to around 36 degrees Fahrenheit, well outside anything the shuttle had flown in before. Ice coated the launch tower. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters, had objected the night before the launch, warning that the rubber O-rings sealing the booster joints had never been tested below 53 degrees and could fail in the cold. Their concerns were overruled. The mission had already slipped 6 times because of weather and mechanical delays, and the pressure to fly had become its own kind of momentum. The countdown continued. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off, and for just over a minute the ascent looked completely normal. Then, at roughly 48,000 feet, a plume of flame escaped a failed joint in the right booster, breached the external fuel tank, and the vehicle broke apart under the aerodynamic stress of a climb it could no longer sustain. The last audible words from the cockpit recorder belonged to Michael Smith, "Uh-oh." A fraction of a second later, the orbiter was gone. What the cameras captured, that spreading fireball and the 2 boosters corkscrewing off in opposite directions, was not the crew compartment being destroyed. It was the external tank rupturing and releasing its propellant. The forward crew cabin, a reinforced section built to withstand the pressures of spaceflight, did not disintegrate in that instant. It tore free from the rest of the vehicle largely intact, carrying all 7 astronauts still strapped inside. Because the cabin still had upward momentum from the climb, it did not immediately fall. It continued rising for several more seconds, reaching an estimated altitude near 65,000 feet, higher than any airliner flies, before gravity took over. The shuttle program had never built any means of escape for failure at that stage of flight. There were no ejection seats for the full crew, no separable capsule, no parachute system for the cabin itself. The vehicle had been designed around the assumption that a breakup during ascent would not be survivable, so no provision existed for surviving one. From its peak, the cabin fell for roughly 2 minutes and 45 seconds before striking the surface of the Atlantic at somewhere around 200 miles per hour, a speed at which water no longer behaves like a cushion, but like solid ground. This is the piece of the account most people have never heard, and it is worth pausing on, because it changes the picture entirely. In the years since, investigators established that at least some of the crew were alive and conscious for at least part of that fall. 4 personal egress air packs, emergency oxygen supplies meant only for ground emergencies, never designed for use in flight, were recovered from the wreckage. 3 of them had been switched on. These packs did not activate automatically. Each one required someone to physically reach over and flip a switch. Analysis showed the packs belonged to Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnik, and Michael Smith. Smith's own activation switch was mounted behind his seat, out of his reach, which means one of the 2 mission specialists seated behind him leaned forward and turned it on for him in the middle of the chaos. It is a small, almost unbearable detail. In the seconds after their spacecraft came apart around them, someone kept enough presence of mind to try to help a crewmate breathe. None of this means the astronauts endured the entire fall in full awareness of what was happening to them. Investigators who examined the wreckage, including physician astronauts who consulted on the medical findings, concluded that the cabin very likely lost pressure rapidly after the breakup, which at that altitude could have caused loss of consciousness within seconds. The extent to which any crew member remained aware for the full 2 minutes and 45 seconds could not be determined with certainty, and NASA's official position was, and remains, that this cannot be established beyond doubt. What the evidence does show is that the impact with the ocean was catastrophic enough that death would have been immediate. Whatever happened during the fall itself, it did not end in a slow or drawn-out way. The fall was long. The end was not. While the world was still absorbing the image of smoke against blue sky, a search operation was already forming off the Florida coast. Coast Guard helicopters and Navy vessels moved toward the debris field within minutes, and for a brief window the effort was officially a search and rescue, because protocol required treating every possibility as open until proven otherwise. But the people running that operation understood, almost immediately, that the shuttle had never carried the means for anyone to survive a breakup at that altitude and speed. By the end of the first day, the operation's language shifted from rescue to recovery, a quieter word, one that carries no expectation of a miracle, only the determination to bring people home. What followed became one of the largest recovery operations NASA had ever conducted. Debris was scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean, some of it floating, much of it already sinking. Ships equipped with sonar divided the search zone into a grid and mapped the seafloor section by section, and wherever sonar returned an object too regular to be natural, divers went down to confirm it by hand. It was slow, physically brutal work carried out in cold water and poor visibility, by people who had not built the shuttle or flown it, but were now the ones tasked with recovering what remained of it. Of everything scattered across that seafloor, the single object investigators most needed to locate was the crew cabin, both because it was the largest intact structure and because it was where the astronauts had been. On March 7, 1986, more than 5 weeks after the launch, divers operating from the salvage ship USS Preserver located the cabin roughly 16 to 18 miles northeast of the launch site, resting in about 100 feet of water. It was badly damaged, with the heaviest fragmentation on one side consistent with the force of hitting the ocean at high speed, but it was identifiable, and the remains of all 7 crew members were recovered from within it. NASA's public statement at the time was deliberately brief. Families had been notified, and the agency would not comment further until recovery and identification were complete. That restraint was not evasiveness. It was a decision, made and largely upheld, to keep the most painful part of the process away from cameras and speculation, so that 7 families could learn what had happened to the people they loved without it becoming public spectacle. Identifying the remains and returning them to their families took weeks, using the forensic tools available at the time, dental records, skeletal analysis, and personal effects recovered with the wreckage. By early May, the remains had been transferred from Kennedy Space Center to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, escorted by an honor guard, with no public ceremony held at that stage out of respect for the family's wishes. Some crew members were later laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Others were returned to their home states to be buried among family. A portion of the recovered cabin structure was buried at sea, at a location that was never disclosed publicly, specifically so it could not become a site visited out of morbid curiosity rather than remembrance. The investigation into the cause moved in parallel with the recovery. The Rudges Commission, formed to determine what had gone wrong, traced the failure to an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster that had hardened and lost its ability to seal in the unusually cold temperatures of that January morning. But the Commission's findings went further than a single mechanical part. It described a culture within NASA and its contractors that had, over years, come to treat repeated warning signs as routine, a pattern of normalized risk that made the eventual failure almost predictable in hindsight, even though it felt sudden and unthinkable to everyone watching that morning. In the aftermath, the shuttle program was grounded for 32 months while the booster joints were redesigned and the decision-making process that had allowed the launch to proceed despite clear warnings was overhauled. NASA also added a crew escape system to future orbiters, a pole and parachute arrangement intended for use during controlled gliding emergencies, though even this would not have helped in a breakup as sudden and violent as Challenger's. It was, in its own limited way, an acknowledgement of the gap in the original design, that the vehicle had simply never been built with a survivable answer to catastrophic failure during ascent. None of what happened after the breakup was hidden as a matter of covering something up. Reporters at the time noted the deliberate restraint in NASA's public statements, and in the years since, information about the cabin's fall, the recovery operation, and the PEAP findings has become part of the public record through official reports, journalists, and the astronauts and investigators who eventually spoke about it. It simply never displaced the image most people already carried: the fireball, the forking smoke trails, the sense that the end came in an instant. That image was not wrong about what people saw. It was incomplete about what happened next. 7 people who trained for years, who had families waiting on the ground, and who believed they were flying toward one of the more ordinary missions in the shuttle program's history, did not get the ending anyone hoped for that morning. But the account of what happened to them afterward is not one of secrecy or scandal. It is one of an exhausting, methodical effort by strangers to bring them home, of a small number of investigators handling the hardest kind of evidence with as much care as the moment allowed, and of a program that used what it learned, however late, to make every flight that came after somewhat safer. That, more than the wreckage of the headlines, is the part of this that still matters, not the 73 seconds the world remembers, but everything that came after, carried out quietly, by people determined to do right by 7 names that deserve to come home.